Hi, welcome to Medyascope. Today our guest is Rustin Zarkar, and Rustin is a PhD candidate at NYU's Middle Eastern Studies Department with a wide variety of interests, including material and visual culture, urban studies, literature, and others. Rustin is also one of the editors of Ajam Media Collective, and today with Rustin we will talk about Ajam's new project called Mahalo. For our Turkish-speaking audience, it's the same word with Mahalo, neighborhood. And I won't say too much about it because Rustin will explain us the details of the project. But before going into Mahalo project, I want to start with Ajam and ask you, Rustin, can you tell us a bit more about the Media Collective? And I know that in your website you have a tab, like a section called Why Ajam? Mm-hmm. So why Ajam? Why did you choose that name, and what kind of articles you publish? What was the purpose of the Media Collective?
Sure. So before I get started, thank you for having me on.
Thank you for participating.
And to get you a little bit acquainted with Ajam and what Ajam does. So we are a online platform, an independent online platform that is dedicated to producing cultural analysis, political analysis about Iran, the Central Asia, and the Caucasus primarily. And it came out of a moment of frustration, actually, when we created it in 2011. We were a bunch of graduate students at Harvard University at the time, and we were kind of disillusioned with some of the discussions that were happening inside the academy and its lack of accessibility towards, let's say, the general audience. Mm-hmm. And all these discussions that we're having, lively discussions in the academy, in panels and conferences, they weren't really penetrating the public sphere very much. And this was around the early Obama period, right? So, you have discussions about drone strikes, you have Afghanistan, you have the nuclear deal in Iran. So we basically started as a way to bring some of these discussions in academia out into a more accessible form, which was using social media, using a blog format, and it kind of just grew from there, and we've been doing it for 5 or 6 years now. And over the time, these blog posts about culture and politics have kind of expanded to become a little bit more analytical, do long-form articles. We've experimented with video content, with music content. Now we're recently doing more literature and actual, as opposed to just writing about literature. So we've kind of expanded in terms of what we are discussing about and how we are actually presenting it to the public. So experimentation with form, but also with content as well. And in terms of what Ajam means, so mm-hmm. I'm sure you have the same word in Turkish, but Ajam comes from the Arabic Ajam, mm-hmm. Which is literally means mute. And so in the Iranian context, it has been primarily it was primarily used as a derogatory term to refer to Persians. And while it's a very complicated subject because mm-hmm. this was primarily in the pre-modern period when this term was being used, but over time, this word was kind of accepted into the Iranian literary sphere. Mm-hmm. And Iranian writers started to refer to themselves as Ajam. And writers such as Ferdowsi, Nazami, the old greats, right? Mm-hmm. They were using this term to refer to themselves, but it also started to appear in history works, it started to appear in, prose. So we've kind of taken this term to really play and kind of challenge the conceptions of Middle Eastern studies in the American Academy, but also within the Iranian American community. Because Ajam also is not purely a term that is used in the Iranian context. It's also a term that signifies otherness. And it was used in Andalusia, mm-hmm. It's used in sub-Saharan Africa, as it was used in Yemen to refer to the Ottomans in the 19th century. So
we use it in Turkish too.
Exactly. So it's always used to denote this otherness. And so what we tried to do was, by taking on the moniker of Ajam, we wanted to write from the margins, especially within the conception of Middle Eastern studies. Mm-hmm. And in doing so, we can show the types of, the diversity of voices, the diversity of stories that are kind of in these marginal and liminal borderlands that are have a great potential for further analysis and further discussion.
And you started this new project called Mahalo, Neighborhood.
Yes.
So can you tell us a bit more about the scope of that project?
Sure. So Mahalo, we use the Azeri pronunciation because our primarily neighborhood was in Baku. But so Mahalo is pretty much a online digital repository and a digital mapping initiative where we are going to neighborhoods that are being demolished, currently being demolished, or have plans to be demolished. And these are also rapidly changing neighborhoods. So when I say demolish or demolition, it's not necessarily that these neighborhoods just disappear, but
urban transformation.
Urban transformation. And I'm sure in Istanbul we have plenty of examples of this as well. But the idea here was to use new sorts of technologies that are available to us in the digital humanities, in social media, to be able to track these rapidly changing neighborhoods through these state-led urbanization campaigns, through predatory real estate speculation, through neoliberal construction projects. So these processes that are affecting people on a global scale, we wanted to focus them in individual and local settings. So how we're doing this, we're using 360-degree cameras, mostly consumer grade because the technology is still very new, traditional documentary footage, interviews, and collecting oral materials and photography that we find in these sites. And generally, it's been quite rewarding because we're in the neighborhoods, we're meeting people who are experiencing this process.
Before going into that, like how you do the project, I want to ask, because you chose three neighborhoods in three cities, I guess, in Baku, Tbilisi, and Dushanbe. So, like, why did you choose these three cities? It was more of because of logistics? So you have some people there, or do you think there's a common theme that weaves these cities together? There's maybe an analytic lens that you want to implement when you do this project?
Well, yeah. So just to give you a better sense of why we're focusing on a neighborhood, right? Mahalo as a space of social networking and social connections that are being formed within a geographic space, right? So by focusing on this local environment, we can look at more global trends and and larger trends. So by focusing, let's say, in one neighborhood in Baku or one neighborhood in Tbilisi and one neighborhood in Dushanbe, we're able to see the various global processes that are occurring within these places. So in terms of logistics and why we chose these particular neighborhoods, first of all, the easiest and most obvious choice was that we actually had collaborators on the ground in these neighborhoods. So for example, in Baku, we worked out of a neighborhood called Sovietsky, which has been, I would say, is 90% demolished now, but has been going through this process of demolition for the last 4 or 5 years now. And this neighborhood was a 19th century working class neighborhood that was right in the center of the city, that was a historical neighborhood with over 200, 300 historical monuments, a population of 60,000 people, and had a very rich and connected community. And as it was being demolished, there was many protests going on, many different NGOs and various individuals who were writing about this. So we saw this as kind of an area that was really bringing out some sort of resistance, but also really needed some sort of help to kind of connect these different places together. Now, in terms of Baku, Tbilisi and Dushanbe, we can immediately tell that these are post-Soviet cities, right? And while we want to focus on a lot of these urban beautification projects that post-Soviet states are doing, we also want to stress that these neighborhoods and these cities are very different, and there are different responses to, let's say, this post-Soviet moment. And
sure. I mean, when you say post-Soviet, I wonder if we can talk of a Soviet city. Do you think, in terms of doing urban research, is it a meaningful categorization? And how, like you said, that from going through, looking at these local spaces, you want to look at more bigger, maybe global or processes. So, how does I mean, I know you said that these are very different three cities, but being situated in post-Soviet countries, how does affect the urban space and urban transformation? Can you talk a bit more about that?
So I think when most people hear the term post-Soviet, a very particular image comes to their mind. We think about planned cities, we think about, Khrushchev-era like housing projects. While some of these are accurate images that come up to our mind, we also have to think that this term can be complicated and is not as purely as descriptive and as accurate as we want due to various responses of the last 25, 30 years that these individual states and municipalities have had in developing these cities. So while we can look at very similar processes and very similar architectures, let's say in Baku and in Tbilisi and in Dushanbe, you can also see different responses to how to beautify the space, various forms of socioeconomic relations, whether or not there's oil money like in Baku, or let's say we're dealing with relatively economically strapped situation in Dushanbe, or we have a different beautification initiative in Tbilisi. So post-Soviet has kind of, I would say it does more harm than good in terms of the abilities for us to imagine what these cities, how they've developed and how they've gone through. But I think we can complicate this narrative a little bit, and hopefully with this Mahalo project, we can show and we can emphasize different elements and different issues that are very important and occurring in these specific locations. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, totally. So I mean, we stopped there, but I want to go back to the like background, to the logistics of this project. So can you tell us a bit more, like what kind of equipment you use when you go to a mahalle, with whom do you speak, and how like the residents of these neighborhoods respond to your project, and what did they tell you about how they experienced all these things that you're looking at too? So can you tell us about the things that we don't see when we look at the articles on Ajam's website?
Yeah. So I think this is a very good question, because you kind of only are seeing these 360-degree videos and you're seeing these documentaries, but you don't actually see the planning and the preparation that goes into us embedding ourselves into these neighborhoods, right? So first of all, these are not apolitical spaces. These neighborhoods are actively being demolished, actively being changed. There are various political initiatives that are occurring. Social issues are coming to the foreground. So it's very strange for a group of activists to just come out and place a camera in the center of the intersection, right? People are going to ask questions. So in terms of how we got to this point where this was acceptable for us to kind of move around this space, we had to frequent these areas. We had to form connections. We had to speak to residents. We had to embed ourselves within this social fabric in a way for us to really be able to extract the information and the content that we were looking for. So for example, in Baku, we had local journalists and we had residents of the neighborhood that have been frequenting this area for at least 4 or 5 months beforehand. And we were able to go and place 360-degree video cameras in particular intersections and capture space, record and capture footage of everyday life in these spaces. So, we would also do social spaces, whether it was, the local kebab stand or just an alleyway where children were playing soccer. These were things that we were trying to capture, basically how people live their everyday lives. And it's very interesting because in this process of filming Sovietsky in Baku, which was our first neighborhood, you can actually see the difference in types of footage that we were able to capture in the 6 months that we were there. So, at the beginning, mostly people wanted to talk about the streets and kind of these abstract things that really didn't have much to do with their own personal experiences. But as we kind of continued to come back to these neighborhoods, made newer connections, these stories became more personal. We were able to do more biographical segments. Additionally, the fact that this neighborhood, Sovietsky, was being demolished, the longer this process of demolition happened, people became more open to talk about it because there was less political consequences for doing so, right? Because as I'm sure you've heard in Azerbaijan, the situation for journalism and for recording interviews is kind of tenuous at the moment. So people were somewhat cautious as to be giving their individual stories. But as they've lost their homes, as they continue to get pushed further and out, further out of the city, people became more open to expressing or recalling their memories of living in the city, of expressing their discontent or their general feelings about the demolition process. So I think behind the footage that you see and behind the articles, you see this process of embedding oneself into these neighborhoods, of spending time on the ground, building connections, and trying to actually bring these residents into the content creation process. It's not just us as journalists coming in and treating these people as human subjects, but how can we better engage these residents and have the local population.
Do you think you're successful in doing that?
Well, this is a very good question, and I think that we could be more successful. I think one of the things that
what was the main difficulties of?
I think the main difficulty has been trying to explain what the project is for. Because, as you know, for us, academics and people in the humanities and journalists, we find these projects very fascinating. We're like, oh yeah, urbanization, social lives being told in the built environment and the social fabric that runs through the built environment. For everyday people, mostly it's just like, okay, you're filming, construction sites. Like, what's the point? But, we've kind of learned a little bit how to better engage and better explain what the projects are for as time has gone on. So it's not purely an intellectual project, right? We're not just trying to explain or kind of chart this.
Or analyze.
Analyze it, but also show that this is actually a tool that could be used for right to the city initiatives, for future problems with dealing with state-led urbanization programs. If you can create a space for this.
Is there an organized urban movement in Sovetski or in Baku?
Yeah, so this is a very good question because I would say earlier, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, when these decisions were announced, you had the Mahalo, right? The Mahalo. People in these communities coming out and actively protesting. And you also had local NGOs that were covering this and trying to engage with the local inhabitants, but also various media outlets. So I would say it was much more lively back then, but as the demolition continued to go on, I would say there's been less political and social engagement now. But to say that it's not there would be incorrect. It's definitely there. But I would say that mostly the resistance has come individually. So for example, homes now are being, as opposed to a movement, let's say, what you see now is individual homes are being occupied by families. And the way they're trying to get around demolition is they're always trying to keep a family member at home at all times, because if one day the entire family leaves to go to a wedding or to go out to work, they might come home and the house might be gone. So you can see these people who are actively trying to stay in the homes, occupy the space, for the reason of trying to show the state that their home has either historical value, B, that they're just not having this this process, or C, that they can try to get more money out of this compensation scheme that has been that, let's say, the government has given in as compensation for demolishing these homes. So these are the 3 primary reasons why people are individually resisting the demolition, but it's happening more on an individual basis and less now on a mass movement basis.
And I mean, what happens to people living in these neighborhoods when they're, if the government managed to demolish their houses, where do they go? Do they go to other mahallas? Are they from other mahallas, or how that's?
So this is a very good question, because when we think of mahalla or mahalla, we have this, what is a mahalla, right? So originally the idea comes from a corridor, right? A walled neighborhood where you had either a house of worship or various social institutions such as a coffee shop or a general public space in which people gathered and formed social relations, and everyday life was lived, right?
You defined, because you wrote like an introductory essay to the project, and you defined the mahalla as the central organizing system for everyday life for people who are living there.
Right. I mean, I think historically this was the case. Like before we had these large boulevards that would cut through the large cities of, let's say, Tehran and Istanbul, or even Baku. Like most neighborhoods worked within these very small, intertwined, labyrinthine, micro cities, right? Where you had your own mosque, or you had your own church, or you had, the school, you had the local kahvekhane, like coffee shop. Yeah. And these were the primary central organizing categories of identity, of social relations, of belonging. As we see these modernization processes in the 20th century pick up steam in, let's say, the Middle East and the Caucasus, these neighborhoods become more interconnected to other neighborhoods. You see a notion of a capital or a city or a municipality becoming more vibrant, more powerful. So the concept of mahalleh is actually under threat, I believe. And in terms of creating new mahallehs, I don't think, I think that these were more historical units. And nowadays, for example, when people are leaving Sovietsky, they're being pushed out into new housing projects that are built in the periphery of the city, right? So these large, and I'm sure in Istanbul is the same, like you see this.
Toki buildings, maybe.
Yes, like these very large buildings, but multi-storied floors with hundreds of residents living there. But where is the mosque? Where is the church? Where is the school? Like these things are no longer within a prime location, but also where's the public space, right? Where is the streets where the kids would play soccer? Where is the place where people will put down a backgammon table and play games? Those spaces that were kind of a part of the built environment of the mahalleh are becoming shifted, or they're changing in a way that I would say that mahalleh as an organizing feature is becoming less common, especially with the various types of beautification and construction projects that have happened in the last 30 years.
Now I will move away from the mahalleh project.
Sure.
I know that you've been living in St. Petersburg for a year, I guess?
Around 8 months.
And you told me that you've been in a community of urban activists there. So actually, I have no idea about urban transformation, urban activism in St. Petersburg. But as I have you here, can you tell us a bit about what's going on in St. Petersburg?
Sure. So, as you know, St. Petersburg is a very, very architecturally beautiful city, right? It was built in the 1700s by Peter the Great. But it was a planned city, right? And you have these beautiful Baroque buildings. You have these wide avenues and boulevards where people are going about, living their everyday life. But you can see that the residents of Istanbul, sorry, not Istanbul, but St. Petersburg, they have a very strong connection to St. Petersburg's identity as architectural wonder, right? So, for example, you're seeing a lot of urban activism happening around Right to the City initiatives, right? Also making sure that buildings that are being, historical buildings are being used properly or being used by the residents of the city. But you also have issues, I can speak primarily about a particular issue that my friend Fyodor has been working on, where let's say the large cathedral in the city is St. Isaac's Cathedral. And St. Isaac's Cathedral has, very similar to Hagia Sophia, was turned into a museum under the Soviet period, and has primarily functioned as a museum up until very recently, when the Russian state wanted to hand back the museum to the religious authorities and to turn it back into a functioning cathedral. And the people of Istanbul, I keep saying Istanbul, I think it's because I'm here, but the people of St. Petersburg, they were some had actually opposed this decision. They wanted to keep it as a museum. So for the first time in a very long time, they had a very large protest to oppose this right to making St. Isaac's Cathedral back into a church. So you see these particular actions. You also see public initiatives for making the city more friendly, to making the city more accessible. So they have a thing called Restaurant Day, for example. So you have people who are actively out in the streets delivering food, setting up. They recognize that a lot of restaurants are financially limiting, right? They're constraining for certain people. So some activists, they volunteer and they sign up to bake food and to make food and serve it on the street to passerbys. So for 1 or 2 days out of the year, the city becomes a giant restaurant, right? So you have these very fun projects, but also they challenge state power, right? So it's not purely just activists speaking to one another, but they're engaging with.
So they have more access to the communities.
Exactly.
And,
And I would say that I can't really speak about the issues in Russia at large because I've only spent time in St. Petersburg, but it's a very vibrant community of activists and right to the city actions, of people trying to actively engage and reclaim certain spaces that maybe due to increased neoliberalism, due to also the legacies of the Soviet Union, they're trying to make this space their own. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rustin, for participating in our show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. So, okay, one last thing.
Sure.
So, I mean, people can send articles to Ajam, right?
Yes.
Maybe you would
so
like to
we have
talk about it.
Yeah, so we have, if you visit our website, ajammc.com, we have a contact tab, and you can see that if you were interested in sending us an article, like send us an email. We'll keep in touch. And generally, our articles we have a very good collaborative process with our writers. We speak to them about how we can develop the idea, but also we do a collaborative editing process.
They don't have to be academics, right? Like journalists, like.
No, we accept journalists, we accept academics. We also do other types of media. So if people or filmmakers are interested, if poets are interested, we can also work with this as well. So basically, a cultural hub for anything dealing with Turkey, Iran, Central Asia, the Caucasus. So.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, today we spoke with Rustin Zarkar on Ajam Media's latest project, Mahalo, and Rustin explained us the urban transformation projects and how they document what's going on in the neighborhoods that are subject to these projects. Yeah, I forgot what I yeah, so like he explained us Ajam's project and how they document what's going on these neighborhoods that are subject to urban transformation. Thank you again, Rustin.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
You too.